What would you do if you woke up one day and realized your legs were gone? And what if, in that agonizing pain, you realized the person who cut them off was the son you loved more than life itself? This isn't a movie. This is my life. This is the true story of how greed turned my own flesh and blood into a monster, and how I was left to die all for money. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be told, even if they shake your faith in humanity. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. But to understand how I ended up in that cabin, helpless and betrayed, you need to understand the life that led me there. You only understand the present when you know the past, as my late mother used to say. And my past, my friend, has more curves than the New River snaking through these Virginia lands. You spend your whole life protecting a child, giving your blood, sweat, and tears, only for him to literally cut off your legs and leave you to die just to get his hands on money that wasn't even his yet. Because what I'm about to tell you sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it happened to me in real life. And I need the world to know that these things happen, even within your own family. That morning, when I woke up in the cabin, I couldn't even remember how I had gotten there at first. The memories came in flashes, jumbled pieces like a puzzle that my dazed mind was trying to assemble. The little face of Martin as a child, smiling with his mouth smeared with peach juice, mixed with his adult face, smiling in a different way, a cold way, as I felt my body grow heavy, my consciousness slipping away after the tea he had given me. "Here, Mom, this will do you good." And I, foolishly trusting him. Why wouldn't I trust him? He was my boy, my only son, my own flesh and blood. The pain was so immense that I thought I would faint again, but something inside me, a strength I didn't even know I had, kept me conscious. I don't know if it was anger, the survival instinct, or the will not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me dead like that. I looked around, trying to understand where I was. It was an old log cabin, abandoned for a long time. The roof had holes, the floor was packed earth. Near me, I saw a half-full jug of water and a bag with a few packages of crackers and cans of sardines. Pure cruelty, leaving just enough food to prolong the suffering, but not enough to truly survive. There's another detail that makes my blood boil just thinking about it. Next to the old mattress where I lay was a cell phone, an old flip phone, with the battery almost dead. When I managed to grab it and open it, I saw that there was no signal, not a single bar. It was just for me to try in vain to call for help. To heighten my despair, Martin knew exactly what he was doing. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail. Most folks won't believe it. They'll ask, "How is that possible?" But my son, you see, he'd studied medicine. He knew exactly how to cut to keep me alive, just barely. Long enough for me to taste every last drop of his cruelty. That wasn't ignorance, my friends. That was calculated, cold-blooded evil. This wasn't just an attack. It was psychological torture. He didn't just want her dead. He wanted her to suffer every single second. Left completely helpless, Clara May now faces an impossible choice: give up or find a strength she never knew she had. To let his mother struggle like a fish out of water, fruitlessly trying to use a phone with no signal until the battery died completely. I dragged myself as best I could to the cabin door. That's when I saw where I really was. In the middle of nowhere, as far as the eye could see, only the woods, that twisted, dry, thorny vegetation of the mountains. Not a house, not a visible road, only the sound of the wind and the birds. And there, near the door, I saw what made me understand that he truly wanted me to die suffering: fresh tire tracks. He had brought me there by truck. He had drugged me, amputated my legs with who knows what, applied a crude, minimal dressing, just enough so I wouldn't bleed out immediately, and then abandoned me in this godforsaken place. "I won't lie to you," I cried. I cried so much I thought I would dehydrate just from crying. I cried from pain, from fear, from anger, from despair, and I cried from disappointment. A disappointment so deep, I can't even properly explain it. How could that boy I carried in my belly for months, whom I breastfed, whom I taught to walk, to talk, to be a person, how could he have done this to me? The question hammered in my head as the tears streamed down. But deep down, very deep down, I already knew the answer. Money. Always the damned money. Right in that moment, when my tears ran dry, I had to ask myself, Clara May, where did you go wrong? Did you spoil him rotten? If you're listening to me now, and you have children, love them. Love them with all your heart. But Lord, don't you forget to give them boundaries. Sometimes, love without limits is the very seed that grows a monster like this. The land I had in the Blue Ridge Mountains, inherited from my late husband, the house in Galax, the investments we had made over the years. Martin never had the patience to wait. He wanted everything, right now, his way. He had been like that since he was little. And after he married that woman, Tiffany, it got even worse. The two of them were always asking me about the will, about the status of the property deeds. I pretended not to notice their intentions. I thought it was just their anxiety. What mother wants to believe that her own son is just waiting for her to die to get his hands on what is hers? When the tears dried, determination set in. The same determination that had been with me my whole life, since I was a girl helping my cattle driver father move herds through these Appalachian trails. I wasn't going to die there. I wasn't going to give Martin that satisfaction. I would survive, if only out of sheer spite. I managed to drag myself back inside, took a few sips of water from the jug, and began to examine my wounds more closely. The dressings were brutally simple, but I could see they had been applied with a specific, cold knowledge to stop the major bleeding, and nothing more. I needed to clean them properly, to prevent infection. I looked around and saw that the cabin, though abandoned, had belonged to some old prospector or hunter. There were some old rags in a corner, a kerosene lamp without kerosene, some cracked plates. It would have to do for now. I tore one of the rags into strips, using my teeth to help, since I had no scissors or knife. I uncapped the water jug and carefully began to clean the stumps of my legs. It was one of the hardest moments of my life. The pain was excruciating. Every touch was like 1,000 red-hot needles piercing my flesh. I bit down on a piece of cloth to keep from screaming, because deep down I knew I needed to conserve energy. I couldn't afford the luxury of passing out again. When I finished cleaning, I saw that the cut had been made with something sharp, maybe a saw or an axe. A surgeon's precision wasn't the goal, but the knowledge of one was behind it. He knew exactly where to cut, and what tool would inflict the most terror while keeping me alive. It was so brutal, so cruel, that just remembering it makes my throat tighten. I redressed the wounds as best I could, using the cleanest rags I could find. Afterward, exhausted, I lay there, staring at the hole-filled ceiling of the cabin. The sun was already low outside. Soon it would be night. A dark night, with no electricity, no one to help, with the pain throbbing and the darkest thoughts crowding my mind. That's when I remembered my grandmother, my father's mother, a Cherokee woman who knew the plants of these woods like no one else. She always used to say, "Clara May, my granddaughter, there is no sickness that nature cannot cure. You just have to know where to find the remedy." My grandmother had taught me about medicinal herbs since I was a little girl. I knew every plant in the woods by its smell, the shape of its leaf, the color of its flower. I knew which one was for fever, which one stopped bleeding, which one fought infection. And that knowledge, which many city folk think is just old wives' tales, was going to be my salvation. If I could drag myself outside, if I could identify the right plants around the cabin, maybe I had a chance. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, I gathered all the strength I had left and dragged myself out of the cabin. I used my arms to pull myself along, my elbows scraping against the hard earth, the pain in my amputated legs making me see stars. But I didn't give up. Inch by inch, I moved forward, examining every bush, every herb that grew there. And it was as if my grandmother was there with me, guiding my eyes. I recognized yarrow, whose leaves are powerful for healing wounds. I saw witch hazel, great for reducing pain and inflammation. I even found a patch of golden seal, which fights infection like no antibiotic. Using my teeth and nails, I tore off what I could of these plants. I dragged myself back to the cabin, this time carrying my green treasure. I mashed the leaves and bark between two stones I found near the door. I mixed it with a little water from the jug and made a thick, greenish paste. When I applied it to the wounds, the pain was so intense I almost fainted, but I held on. I knew it was my only chance. In the days that followed, I repeated the process. I would crawl out in search of plants, come back, prepare the natural remedies, and treat my wounds. The food Martin had left ran out quickly, as did the water jug. I had to improvise. I discovered that the cabin was near a small creek, about 100 yards into the woods. Dragging myself there was torture, but necessary. I found fruits from the woods that could be eaten: pawpaws, persimmons, blackberries. It wasn't much, but it kept the hunger at bay. I remember one night, maybe 2 weeks after that terrible awakening, when a storm broke over the cabin. The rain poured through the holes in the roof. The wind howled. The thunder shook the fragile log walls. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from fear. Fear that the cabin would collapse on me. Fear that the creek would overflow and drown me, since I couldn't run. Fear that after so much effort to survive, nature would end up finishing the job my son had failed to do properly. It was on that night, huddled in a less wet corner of the cabin, that I made a decision. I wouldn't just survive. I would go back. I would confront Martin. I would make him pay for what he did. Not for revenge, though God knows I had the right, but for justice, so that he could never do to another person what he did to me, so that no one else would have to go through what I was going through. That storm didn't break her, it forged her. This is the moment the victim becomes a warrior. It's no longer just about survival, it's about justice. But to get that justice, she must first find a way to move. With this renewed determination, I began to work not just on my survival, but on my adaptation. I needed to find a better way to move than dragging myself. Looking around the cabin and its surroundings during my increasingly long expeditions for food and water, I found pieces of wood that could serve my purpose. Strong branches, old planks left by whoever built the cabin. With patience, using rocks as hammers and hard thorns as nails, I began to assemble something like crutches. It wasn't easy. My first attempts broke as soon as I tried to put my weight on them, but I didn't give up. I tried, failed, learned, and tried again. I used plant fibers to tie the parts together, tree resin to give the joints more strength. After many attempts, I managed to make a pair of rustic but functional crutches. They weren't pretty or comfortable, but they allowed me to stand up, to move without having to crawl like an animal. The next step was more ambitious: prosthetics. I had once seen on a television documentary how people with amputated legs used prosthetics to walk almost normally. Of course, the ones on TV were modern, made of carbon fiber and titanium. I had wood, plant fibers, and a lot of stubbornness. I began to carve pieces of wood, trying to give them the approximate shape of legs. Using tree resin as glue, I attached cushions made of moss and plant fibers where the stumps of my legs were supposed to fit. The first versions were a disaster. Unstable, uncomfortable, they caused more pain than they helped. A woman pushing 80, no legs, sitting in the dirt, whittling wood with a sharp rock. Sounds like madness, doesn't it? But when life pins you to the ground, you've got two choices. You can crawl like an animal and wait to die, or you can stand up like a person. I chose to stand, no matter how much blood and pain it cost me. But each failure taught me something new. I adjusted, adapted, improved the design, until one day, almost 3 months after waking up in that cabin, I managed to stand up using my makeshift prosthetics. I took my first steps, wobbly and uncertain, but they were steps. I was no longer bound to the ground, condemned to crawl. I had regained some of my autonomy, my dignity. Throughout this time, my knowledge of the Appalachian plants was my greatest ally, not only for treating the wounds and preventing infections, but also as food and even as medicine for the depression that sometimes threatened to overwhelm me. Because yes, there were moments when I thought about giving up, moments when the pain, the loneliness, and the despair seemed too great to bear. In those moments, I would prepare a tea from chamomile, a small plant that grows in low patches and has a calming effect. I would drink it slowly, watching the sunset through the cabin door, and I would say out loud, "No, I'm not giving up today. As the months went by, I established a routine. I would wake up with the sun, drink an herbal tea, adjust my prosthetics, and go out to hunt. Not for animals, which I had no way of killing, but for fruits, roots, and edible plants. I became increasingly skilled at identifying what was safe to eat, what had medicinal properties, and what to avoid. I knew every square foot within a half-mile radius of the cabin. I knew where to find clean water, where the best fruits grew, where the most useful herbs could be harvested. One day, around the 5th month in that situation, something happened that almost ended everything. A timber rattlesnake, not very large, but still threatening, had made a nest near the creek where I got my water. When I approached, unaware of the danger, it struck. By pure reflex, I managed to dodge, but I lost my balance and fell. One of my prosthetics broke with the impact. The snake, perhaps frightened by my scream, retreated and disappeared among the rocks. I lay there, with a broken prosthetic, far from the cabin, not knowing what to do. I was born in Galax, Virginia, in 1946, when the world was still recovering from that terrible war. My father, Walter Thompson, was a cattle driver, one of those tough men, weathered by the sun, who spent weeks driving cattle through the backwoods, taking herds from one farm to another, from one town to another. A man of few words, but whose word was his bond. When he promised something, he delivered, even if the world came to an end. My mother, Beatrice, was a midwife. The most delicate and strongest hands I've ever seen. Hands that brought hundreds of children into the world, including myself, as there was no time to call another midwife when my time came. She alone caught me when I came into the world. Our house was simple, made of logs and chinking, with a thatched roof. But there was never a shortage of love or food on the table. We were poor in money but rich in other ways. Rich in knowledge of the land, the plants, the starry sky that served as a roof when my father camped with the herd. Rich in stories my father brought back from his travels. In songs my mother hummed while she worked. In laughter we shared around the wood stove on cold nights. But the real wealth that shaped my life came from my paternal grandmother, Lily, a Cherokee woman who was swept off her feet, as the polite folk said, by my grandfather. The truth was harsher. It was a time when a white man's will often overruled the customs of her people, and she was taken from her family to be his wife. But my grandmother, cunning as a mountain fox, turned that terrible situation into something different. She did not become submissive as my grandfather expected. She maintained her dignity, her knowledge, her connection with nature. She was the one who cared for the sick in the region when the doctors, rare in those days, couldn't come. She knew every plant in the woods as if they were her own daughters. This one, she would say, picking a fleshy leaf, cures a stomachache. This other one, showing a small yellow flower, brings down a fever faster than a pill from the pharmacy. And it wasn't just old talk. I saw the results with my own eyes. People who arrived, dragging themselves in pain, would leave walking after the teas, tinctures, and poultices that Grandma Lily prepared. From the time I was a tiny thing, about 5 or 6 years old, I would accompany her on her walks through the woods to gather plants. While other girls my age played with dolls, I learned the difference between the yarrow that heals wounds and the false yarrow that can poison you. I could identify a sassafras tree by the smell of its bark before I even saw it. I knew the exact point of ripeness at which a persimmon should be picked to make the most potent medicine. Clara May, Grandma would always say, nature is a mother and a teacher. Never forget that. And I never did. Even when I grew up and school tried to teach me that real knowledge only came from books, I kept that ancestral wisdom stored in my heart, never doubting it. It ended up saving my life many years later. School was a challenge. I was the Indian girl, as the other children called me to mock me. They didn't understand the value of the blood that ran in my veins, mixed with the Scottish-Irish blood of my grandfather and the many others that made up the mix that is me. I only studied up to the 4th grade, the most a poor girl from Galax could dream of in those days. But I learned to read well, write reasonably, and do arithmetic better than many educated men. The rest of my education came from the woods, from the stories of the elders, from experiences lived with my own body and soul. It was at a county fair, one of those with colorful flags, a crackling bonfire, and a fiddler playing until dawn, that I met Harold McAllister. I had just turned 17. He was 53, older than my own father. He was an employee of the Department of Agriculture who had come from Richmond to map planting areas in the region. A respected man, in a well-pressed suit and always shiny shoes, even in the dust of Galax. I don't know what he saw in that skinny girl with a mended dress and poorly made braids. Maybe it was the way I explained the properties of the plants decorating the fair, or maybe it was simply fate, weaving its mysterious paths. The fact is, we started talking that night and never stopped. He was fascinated by my knowledge of the woods. I was fascinated by the stories he told about the newly bustling capital, about the studies he did, about the books he had read. My father didn't like it at all when Harold asked for my hand. "Too old a man," he would grumble. "He'll take you far away and then leave you." But my mother, always more practical, saw the advantages. An established man, with a steady job, who could give me a better life than they had managed. And I confess, was in love, not just with the man, but with the possibility of a different life, of seeing other places, of perhaps even studying more, as he promised. We married 6 months after that county fair. We moved to Richmond. For me, coming from the quiet of Galax, it felt like a different world, a sprawling, busy city, so different from the mountain life I knew. Harold had a small but comfortable apartment in the Fan District, a neighborhood with brick sidewalks and rows of connected houses unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was such a different life from the one I knew that sometimes I felt like a mountain bird trapped in a concrete cage. But Harold was a good husband, patient, kind, proud of his wife who knew the secrets of nature, as he liked to introduce me to his colleagues. Soon, I started trying to get pregnant. I thought it would be easy. After all the women in my family were as fertile as the earth after a rain. But it wasn't quite like that. I lost the first baby at 3 months pregnant, then the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, 5 little angels who went to heaven before they even saw the world. Each loss was a stab in the chest, a pain that not even Grandma Lily's herbs could soothe. The doctors said it was incompatibility, that maybe my body rejected the babies because of the age difference between me and Harold. They spoke in complicated terms I barely understood. Grandma Lily, when she came to visit us, said something else. "It's the spirit of the big city, Clara May. It's not a natural place for a mountain woman to raise her children." After the 5th miscarriage, I had already lost hope. That's when Harold came with some news. He had bought a piece of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains, near Afton. "We'll build a house there," he said. "Spend weekends, vacations. You'll be able to plant your herb garden, breathe fresh air, reconnect with nature." It was the most precious gift anyone could have given me. And it was there, on that land of strong energy, as the mystics say, that I finally managed to carry a pregnancy to term. Martin was born on a full moon night in 1970, weighing almost 9 pounds. A strong, healthy boy who filled our lives with joy. Harold, already 60 years old, cried like a child when he held his son in his arms for the first time. "It's a miracle," he said between sobs. "Our boy is a miracle." That's when the problem that I only understood many years later began. Martin was our miracle, our gift after so much pain, and we treated him as such. Nothing was too good for our son. No wish went unfulfilled, no tantrum went unappeased. Harold, especially, couldn't say no to the boy. Maybe because he became a father so late in life, maybe for fear that something would happen to our only child, he turned Martin into a little prince, and I, who should have been firmer, also gave in. I let the child become the center of our universe, the little sun around which everything revolved. And do you think raising children with too much ease is good or bad? Do you believe that spoiled children become problematic adults? Tell me your honest opinion below, because to this day I wonder if I was the one who raised my Martin badly. If I had been tougher, set more limits, maybe he wouldn't have turned into the man who would one day cut off my legs and leave me to die alone. Martin's childhood was full of privileges I never had. He studied in the best schools in Richmond. He had imported toys, designer clothes, vacations, but at my insistence, he also spent time in the mountains. It was there that I tried to teach him what I learned from Grandma Lily. I showed him the plants, explained their uses, told him the stories of the Cherokee people that ran in my veins. He listened, sometimes with interest, other times with impatience. "What's the point of knowing this, Mom? We can buy medicine at the pharmacy," he'd say with that relentless logic of a city-raised child. When Martin was 12, something happened that would change the course of our lives. Harold suffered a stroke during a meeting at the department. It wasn't severe, but it served as a warning. It was around this time that we met Mr. Eugene, a World War II veteran who had lost his right arm in combat. He was a physical therapist and came to our house to help with Harold's recovery. Mr. Eugene had something extraordinary about him. Despite his disability, he was more agile and independent than many people with all their limbs intact. That was because he himself had developed adaptations for his daily life. Simple prosthetics made from common materials that allowed him to perform almost any task. "Necessity is the mother of invention," he would say with a smile on his wrinkled face. Fascinated, I started helping him during the physical therapy sessions with Harold. I realized I had a knack for it, for understanding how the body moves, how to compensate for a limitation, how to create tools that work as natural extensions of the limbs. Mr. Eugene, noticing my interest, began to teach me. He showed me how he worked with wood, leather, metal, creating handmade prosthetics. "This might seem like the work of a crazy old man," he said. "But one day it might be useful to someone." Little did he know how crucial that knowledge would be for my own survival so many years later. The techniques I learned from Mr. Eugene, combined with my grandmother's knowledge of plants, formed the foundation that allowed me to survive when I was abandoned in the mountains, without my legs. Harold recovered well from the stroke, but he became quieter, more reflective. He began to organize his affairs as if he knew his time was running out. He updated his will, ensuring that Martin and I would be well cared for. He expanded the property in the mountains, buying neighboring lands. He invested money in safe applications. It was as if he was preparing the nest before leaving. And leave he did, when Martin was 17. Another stroke, this time massive. There wasn't even time to get to the hospital. He died in my arms, in the living room of our house, while we waited for the ambulance. His last words were, "Take care of our boy, Clara May. He's special." I was widowed at 41, with a teenage son and a considerable inheritance. The lands in the mountains that Harold had slowly bought over the years now formed an extensive and valuable property. The pension from his high-ranking civil servant job guaranteed a comfortable income. The investments yielded enough so that we didn't have to worry about money. Harold had planned everything carefully, except for one detail: how that sudden wealth would affect our already spoiled son. Martin, who had always had everything he wanted, now saw even greater possibilities opening up. A grieving widow and a son who's always had everything, now left alone with a sudden fortune. This is the moment the seeds of greed, planted so long ago, finally have the perfect soil to grow. And what they grow into is a nightmare. And it was around this time that he began to show a side that I, blinded by motherly love, took too long to recognize. Unbridled ambition, impatience, a certain contempt for limits and rules. Still, it seemed that life would follow a promising course. Martin decided to study medicine, inspired by the doctor who cared for Harold after the first stroke. "I'm going to be a neurosurgeon, Mom," he announced with that youthful certainty. "I'm going to save people like Dad." I swelled with pride. My boy, the son of a semi-literate woman from rural Virginia, studying to be a doctor at the best university in Richmond. The first years of his pre-med studies went well. Martin was smart, learned quickly, and had good grades. But when he started medical school, things started to change. He spent more time away from home, came home late, sometimes smelling of alcohol. I started receiving calls from the university's administration. He was skipping classes, not turning in assignments, and arguing with professors. "It's just a phase," I told myself, wanting to believe it. The pressure of his studies, missing his father. I continued to deposit money into his account when he asked, believing it was for books, materials, the normal expenses of a student. Only much later did I discover that a good part of that money went to expensive clubs, designer clothes, and even betting on horse races, a habit he developed with new friends from college. It was during this time that Martin met Tiffany, beautiful, sophisticated, the daughter of a real estate mogul. She wasn't a medical student, she was studying law at an expensive private university. The two met at one of those exclusive Richmond parties, where imported whiskey flows freely, and the right contacts are worth more than money in the bank. The first time Martin brought Tiffany to our house, I felt a tightness in my chest. It wasn't a mother-in-law's prejudice. No, it was instinct. That sixth sense, my grandmother said every woman has, but not every woman listens to. Tiffany looked at our house, which was not a mansion, but a nice apartment in the Fan District, with a smirk, as if she were entering a shack. She greeted me with 2 air kisses, without actually touching my face, and made a point of showing off the diamond ring my son had given her. A ring that I would later find out cost 3 months of the pension I received. Your mother is. Quaint, I heard her comment to Martin when she thought I wasn't nearby. That country way, that accent. It's different. The way she said different made it clear it wasn't a compliment. Martin, instead of defending his own mother, laughed in agreement. That hurt more than a slap in the face. Martin's visits became rarer. When he did come, it was always in a hurry, always needing money for some emergency he never quite explained. Tiffany rarely accompanied him, always with some excuse. She was studying, had a commitment with her father, was feeling unwell. In reality, as I would learn much later, she simply found it boring to spend time with the old country bumpkin, as she referred to me in her social circles. In his final year of medical school, when Martin should have been preparing for his residency, the bomb dropped. He quit. With only a few clinical rotations and the final exams left to graduate, he simply gave up. When I questioned him, his answers were vague. Medicine is not for me. I want to follow other paths. I have better plans. These better plans soon revealed themselves. He wanted to get into the real estate business with Tiffany's father. That's where the money is, Mom, he explained with a feverish excitement. In 6 months, I could be making more than a junior doctor. In 5 years, I could be a millionaire. I tried to argue. I spoke of the investment in years of study, of the dream of helping people, of the pride Harold would have felt to see his son graduate in medicine. But Martin had that gleam in his eyes that I knew from when he was little. The gleam of someone who has already decided and will not change his mind, even if the world ends. Stubborn like his father, or maybe like his mother too, I have to admit. The wedding to Tiffany took place a few months later, an extravagant party for over 300 guests, most of whom I had never seen before. Her father paid for almost everything, making a point of showing off his economic power. I contributed what I could, more out of pride than necessity. The ceremony was in a cathedral in Richmond, the reception at an exclusive club on the banks of the James River. I felt like a stranger at my own son's party, lost among politicians, businessmen, and socialites who talked about things I barely understood. After the wedding, Martin and Tiffany moved into a luxury apartment in the West End, a prime area of Richmond. A gift from her father, of course. Martin started working at the family's development company, selling properties off-plan, brokering deals. At first, it seemed like everything was going well. He would stop by the house occasionally, always in a hurry, always talking about new projects, new ventures that would revolutionize the Richmond real estate market. But gradually, I began to notice subtle changes. He started asking questions about the land in the mountains, how much it was worth, if I was thinking of selling, if I had updated the deeds. "It's just professional curiosity, Mom," he would justify. "Now that I work with real estate, I need to better understand the family's assets." Tiffany, on the rare occasions she came along, also showed a sudden interest in my properties. "That area in the mountains must be worth a fortune now," she would comment, feigning disinterest. "With the boom in ecotourism, people are paying absurd amounts for land there." She spoke as if it were nothing, but I could see the poorly disguised greed. It was around this time that I started spending more time in the mountains. I said it was for the fresh air, the tranquility, the chance to cultivate my medicinal herbs. That was true, but it wasn't the only reason. I also wanted to get away from that uncomfortable feeling I got from seeing my son and his wife calculating the value of what they could inherit when I was no longer around. In the mountains, I built a simple but rewarding life. I renovated the house that Harold had built so many years before. I planted an herb garden. I started making natural remedies for the local residents. I returned to my roots, to the knowledge I inherited from my grandmother Lily. I created salves, syrups, teas, and tinctures that treated everything from a common cold to more serious problems like diabetes and high blood pressure. I soon gained a reputation in the region. People came from far and wide to consult Mrs. Clara May, the healer. I didn't much like that title. I didn't consider myself a healer, just someone who knew plants and their uses, but I didn't deny help to those who needed it. I charged little or nothing, depending on the person's situation. I didn't do it for money, but for the pleasure of seeing the relief on the faces of those who were suffering, for the honor of keeping my grandmother's knowledge alive. Meanwhile, in Richmond, the life of Martin and Tiffany seemed to be prospering on the surface, but something was wrong. The visits, already rare, became even more infrequent, the phone calls short and vague. When I called, it almost always went to voicemail. When I managed to speak with them, the conversations were rushed, full of excuses about important meetings, unavoidable commitments. Then one day, almost 2 years after the wedding, Martin showed up unexpectedly at my house in the mountains. He was different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, a nervousness I had never seen in him before. He said he missed me, that he wanted to spend a few days with me, to reconnect with his roots. He talked about how he admired my work with medicinal plants, how he wanted to learn more about this ancestral knowledge. At the time, I believed him. What mother doesn't want to believe that her son finally values what she has to teach? I spent days showing him my herbs, explaining how I prepared the remedies, telling the stories I learned from Grandma Lily. He listened with an attention that moved me, asked questions, took notes in a small notebook. What I didn't know then, what I would only discover in the worst possible way, was that this visit had nothing to do with missing me or an interest in medicinal herbs. It was a reconnaissance mission, a survey of the terrain. Martin was in serious financial trouble. The real estate deals hadn't brought the expected returns. He had accumulated debts, gambled too high on ventures that failed. His father-in-law, tired of covering his losses, had washed his hands of him. Tiffany was threatening to leave him if he couldn't regain the luxurious lifestyle he had promised her. And so he turned his eyes to what was most accessible, his mother's inheritance. The lands in the mountains that had appreciated enormously. Harold's pension, which, though not a fortune, was stable and guaranteed. The conservative but solid investments my husband had left. During that visit, he mapped out everything, where the documents were kept, what my routines were, who visited me regularly and who didn't. He observed how I lived in isolation most of the time, how I trusted him blindly, how happy I was with his company, and he began to devise a plan so terrible, so inhuman, that not even in my worst nightmares could I have imagined my own son would be capable of such a thing. 3 months after that visit from Martin, I received a phone call that would change my life forever. It was him, his voice more cheerful than I had heard in years. "Mom, I had a wonderful idea. You deserve a vacation after so much work with your herbs. How about spending a week at our new property? It's an isolated little spot in the mountains, not too far from your house, but with a breathtaking view and incredible energy." I was surprised. Martin had never shown this kind of concern for me before, but a mother's heart is foolish, isn't it? We always want to believe the best in our children. "What property is this, son?" "I didn't know you had bought land in the mountains," I asked, curious. "It's a surprise, Mom. We bought it a little while ago, an unmissable opportunity. It even has an old cabin, one of those authentic log cabins. We've done some basic renovations to make it habitable. It's rustic, but you'll love it. It's the kind of place that suits you," he replied excitedly. I confess I was tempted. The idea of spending a few days with my son, who was suddenly interested in the simple things I valued, filled me with hope. Maybe he was finally maturing, returning to his roots, appreciating what really matters in life. And to be honest, the loneliness sometimes weighed on me. I would spend weeks talking only to the patients who came for remedies, with no one to have a long chat with, to share memories, to laugh with. All right, my son. I accept the invitation. When would it be? I asked, already imagining taking some plant seedlings to start a medicinal garden on their new property. Great, Mom. It can be this weekend. Tiffany and I will come by to pick you up on Friday. Just bring the essentials. It has everything you'll need there, he replied, almost stumbling over his words in his eagerness. The speed of it took me by surprise, but I wasn't suspicious. I just thought he was excited about the idea. All right, son. I'll pack a small bag and wait for you on Friday. On Friday, as planned, Martin and Tiffany arrived at my house in the late afternoon. What surprised me was seeing Tiffany with him. She had never shown the slightest interest in spending time with me, much less in a rustic place in the mountains. But there she was, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, impeccably dressed even for a trip to the country. Mrs. Clara May, what a pleasure to see you again. I'm so excited for the days we're going to spend together, she said, giving me those air kisses that bothered me so much. Something didn't feel right about this, but again, I suppressed the voice of suspicion. After all, it was my son, my Marty, the boy I carried for 9 months after so much suffering. How could I suspect him? The drive was long and quiet. Martin drove with concentration. Tiffany spent most of the time on her phone, and I looked out the window, recognizing every curve, every hill of that region I knew like the back of my hand. After almost 2 hours, we turned onto a dirt road I didn't recognize. It snaked through hills covered in dense mountain vegetation, moving further and further away from the main road. Are you sure this is the way, son? I've never been to this part of the mountains, I commented, a little uneasy with the growing isolation. Sure, Mom. I said it was isolated, didn't I? That's why the view is so spectacular. No one has built anything to spoil the natural landscape, he replied, exchanging a quick glance with Tiffany that I couldn't decipher. Finally, after another half hour on the increasingly precarious dirt road, we arrived. It was indeed an old cabin, as he had said. Log walls, a partially repaired thatched roof, a small porch in front. All around, nothing but the wild woods, no sign of other buildings nearby. Tiffany stayed in the truck while Martin helped me with my small bag. She's feeling a bit carsick from the drive. She'll be in shortly, he explained. Inside the cabin was the bare minimum. A simple bed with a thin mattress, a rustic table with 2 benches, an old wood-burning stove, and a small makeshift bathroom in the back. It wasn't much different from the houses where I grew up, so it didn't bother me. On the contrary, it brought a sense of familiarity, of returning to my origins. It's simple, but it has its charm, doesn't it, Mom? Martin asked, closely observing my reaction. It does, son. It reminds me of my childhood home in Galax. I'll feel right at home here, I replied genuinely. If only I had known how much that sentence would be tested. Tiffany finally came in, looking around with poorly disguised disgust. Well, rustic, she commented, as if it were the most polite word she could find. I'll make us some tea, Martin announced surprisingly. He had never been one for the kitchen, let alone making tea. I brought that herb you like so much, lemon balm. While he fiddled in the small kitchen, Tiffany tried to maintain an artificial conversation with me. But I appreciated the effort, thinking that maybe she was really trying to get closer. Martin returned with 3 steaming mugs of tea. Here you go, Mom. I made it just how you like. I took the mug, my heart swelling with a simple, pure joy. Asterisk, my boy. Asterisk, I thought. Asterisk. He remembers. Asterisk. This will make you sleep like a baby, he added, his smile just a little too wide. We drank the tea as the sun set. The view was indeed spectacular. It would have been a perfect moment if not for the strange metallic aftertaste of the tea and the way Tiffany kept checking her wristwatch. But then something started to happen. My body grew heavy, my vision blurred. I'm feeling strange, I murmured. It's normal, Mom. It's just the fatigue from the trip, Martin replied, but his voice seemed to come from far away. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was my son's face. He was smiling, but it wasn't the sweet smile of my boy. It was something different, cold, calculating, A smile I will never forget as long as I live. It's the moment her world collapses. A mother's trust, shattered by the one person she lived for. But this single act of betrayal is only the beginning of his horrifying plan. "Marty, please, help me," I pleaded, extending a trembling hand toward him. He moved away, as if my touch could contaminate him. "Don't call me that. I'm not a child anymore, and helping is exactly what I'm doing. I'm helping you have a dignified death, isolated, in contact with the nature you love so much. Better than withering away in a nursing home, don't you think?" At that moment, Tiffany entered the cabin. She barely glanced at me, as if I were just an inconvenient object. "Everything's ready outside. The truck is loaded with the things we need to take. We need to go soon, Martin. It's already dark and this road is dangerous at night." "I'm coming," he replied, and then turned to me one last time. We left water, some food, and even a cell phone. It has no signal here, of course, but I thought it would be a humane touch. You can try to call, watch the time pass as the battery dies. An interesting metaphor, don't you think? The calculated cruelty of those words hit me like a punch. This was not my son. It couldn't be. It was a monster wearing his skin. "People will ask for me," I managed to say, my voice firmer, despite the excruciating pain. "They'll look for me." He laughed, a joyless sound. "I've already thought of that, Mom. I'll say you decided to take a spiritual journey, one of those that the mystics of the mountains talk so much about. Then, unfortunately, we'll receive the sad news that you passed away from natural causes during your retreat. Old age, a weak heart. These things happen. No one will suspect. No one will look here. Your own son," I murmured, the tears finally coming, mixing with the cold sweat of shock. "I carried you in my womb. I breastfed you. I raised you." For a brief instant, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Remorse? Doubt? I can't say, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It's better this way, Mom. The pain will pass soon. In a few days it'll all be over." And with that, he left. I heard his footsteps fading, the door slamming, the engine of the truck starting outside, and then silence. A deafening silence, broken only by my own muffled sobs and the distant hum of the mountain insects. I lay there, drifting between consciousness and unconsciousness, the pain coming in waves. I don't know how much time passed before I could gather the strength to better assess the situation. Beside the bed, as he had said, was a 5-gallon jug of water, a few packages of crackers, cans of sardines, and an old cell phone. I picked up the device with trembling hands. As he had predicted, there was no signal, not a single bar. The cabin was small, a single room with the makeshift bathroom in the back. The door was closed but not locked. What difference would it make? With my legs amputated, I wouldn't get far anyway. The small windows were open, letting in the cool night breeze from the mountains and the distant sounds of nocturnal animals. I tried to get up, but the pain was so intense that I fainted again. When I came to, the sun was already streaming through the cracks in the roof. I was feverish, my mouth as dry as sandpaper. I dragged myself as best I could to reach the water jug. I drank directly from the opening, water dribbling down my chin, soaking my nightgown already stained with dried blood. The following days are a blur in my memory. Infections set in quickly in the poorly made cuts. I don't know what he cut my legs with. Maybe an axe or a saw he found in the cabin itself. But it certainly wasn't with clean instruments. He had perverted his medical knowledge, using it not to heal, but to perform a precise, horrifying mutilation. The dressings he improvised were precarious, more to contain the initial bleeding than to offer real protection. The fever rose so high that I started to hallucinate. I saw my grandmother, Lily, sitting at the foot of the bed singing Cherokee songs that she taught me when I was little. I saw Harold, young as when we first met, reaching out his hand to me. I even saw Martin as a child, with that innocent smile that used to melt my heart. "Come on, Mommy," he would say in the hallucination. "Let's go play outside." In some lucid moments, I tried to eat a few crackers, drink more water, but most of the time I floated between feverish nightmares and a pain that seemed to have no end. My body was burning, Yet at the same time, I shivered with cold. The smell of putrefaction began to set in, a sickly odor that not even the constant breeze coming through the windows could completely dissipate. It was in one of those rare moments of clarity that I had the vision that saved my life. Not a hallucination this time, but a vivid memory. My grandmother, Lily, treating a man who had lost his foot in a farming accident. The same herbs she used grew here. I knew it. I had recognized some of them when we arrived the day before. If I could reach them. Gathering strength I didn't know I still had, I dragged myself out of bed. The pain was excruciating, as if my legs were being severed again with every movement. But something inside me, maybe the survival instinct, maybe anger, pushed me forward. Inch by inch, using my arms, my elbows, any part of my body that still responded, I dragged myself toward the door. When I finally reached the porch, the sun was already high. The heat was intense, typical of the mountains at that time of year. I looked around, desperate. Yes, there they were. Yarrow with its powerful healing leaves, witch hazel to reduce inflammation, golden seal, effective against infections, and miraculously, even a clump of pine trees, whose resin is a potent natural antibiotic. I don't know where I found the strength, but I managed to drag myself to these plants. Using my teeth, my hands, any available resource, I gathered what I could. I returned to the cabin more dead than alive, but with a green treasure in my hands. Remembering my grandmother's teachings, I prepared poultices, infusions, rudimentary tinctures with the few resources I had. I tore off the filthy dressings, revealing the horror of the infected cuts. The smell was unbearable, the sight even worse, but I did not back down. I washed the wounds with the golden seal infusion, also taking it internally. I made poultices with the mashed yarrow leaves, covering the entire affected area. I drank the witch hazel tea to combat the fever and pain. And as a final touch, I used the pine resin directly on the deepest cuts. The initial pain was almost unbearable. I bit down on a piece of cloth to keep from screaming, knowing no one would hear me anyway. But slowly, very slowly, the burning sensation gave way to a more bearable tingling. Exhausted by the Herculean effort, I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up, many hours later, the fever had subsided a little. She did it. Using only her teeth, her hands, and the earth, she fought back against death. She bought herself time. But this battle is far from over. The infection was only the first enemy. Now, she faces starvation. I know what you city folks are thinking. You're shaking your heads, saying how can a handful of weeds beat back death itself? But let me ask you, every one of those expensive pills in your medicine cabinet, where do you think they came from? They started right here, in the dirt. They started from the knowledge Grandma Lily passed down, the very knowledge my Martin and his modern world threw away. I wasn't cured, far from it, but I felt I had bought myself some time. The foul smell had slightly diminished. The edges of the wounds, once so red and swollen, seemed a little less inflamed. In the days that followed, I repeated the treatment several times. I would crawl out when I had the strength, gather more plants, return, prepare the remedies, apply them, rest, and start all over again. It was an exhausting, painful cycle, but one that slowly began to show results. The infection, which would have certainly killed me without treatment, began to recede. The fever went down. The hallucinations diminished. The wounds, still horrible to look at, began to show signs of healing at the edges. I was far from being saved, but I was no longer on the brink of death. The water from the jug and the few food items Martin left soon ran out. I had to fend for myself. I would drag myself to the small creek I discovered about 100 yards from the cabin to get water. I learned to identify edible roots and fruits of the woods around me. Pawpaws, persimmons, blackberries, fruits I had known since childhood and which were now my only source of nutrition. It wasn't an ideal diet for someone recovering from a traumatic amputation and a severe infection, but it was what I had. Slowly, my body began to adapt. I gained strength in my arms from so much dragging. I developed calluses on my hands and on the stumps of my legs, which ironically served as a natural protection. One night, Perhaps 2 weeks after being abandoned, a terrible storm broke over the mountains. The old cabin, with its partially repaired roof, was no match for the fury of nature. Water poured in from all sides. The wind threatened to tear the thatch from the roof. Deafening thunder shook the fragile log walls. I huddled in a corner, trying to protect myself from the water running down the walls. It was a night of terror, not just from fear of the storm itself, but from the fear that the infection would return with full force if I got wet and cold. But I survived that too. And when the sun rose the next day, bringing the characteristic warmth of the mountains even after the rain, I felt something different inside me: determination. I would not just survive, I would adapt. I would find a way out of there, back to the world, to get justice. Martin and Tiffany could not get away with what they did to me. Not for petty revenge, but because people capable of such an atrocity were too dangerous to walk free. With this new determination, I began to plan for the longer term. It wasn't enough to treat the wounds and find food for the day. I needed to regain mobility, build tools, find a path to civilization. It was an ambitious plan for an amputated elderly woman, abandoned in the middle of the woods. But it was what kept me alive, what gave me a purpose beyond mere survival. I started with the most urgent issue: how to move better than crawling like a snake. Looking around the cabin and its surroundings during my increasingly long expeditions, I found pieces of wood that could serve my purpose. Strong branches that had fallen after the storm, loose planks from the cabin's own structure. I then remembered the teachings of Mr. Eugene, the veteran who had lost his arm and made his own adaptations. With patience, using rocks as tools and plant fibers as ropes, I began to build primitive crutches. The first attempts were disasters, breaking as soon as I put my weight on them. But each failure taught me something new, and each new version was a little better than the last. After many trials and errors, I had a functional pair of crutches. They weren't pretty or comfortable, but they allowed me to stand, supported on my knees, and move without dragging my body on the ground. It was a huge victory, a fundamental step in regaining not only mobility, but also dignity. The next step was even more ambitious: rudimentary prosthetics. Using the knowledge that Mr. Eugene had shared with me so many years before, I began to carve pieces of wood, trying to give them the approximate shape of legs. I used tree resin as a natural glue to attach cushions made of moss and plant fibers where the stumps of my legs were supposed to fit. The first versions were painful failures. They caused more suffering than they helped, creating new sores on my already mistreated stumps. But I didn't give up. Each version incorporated lessons from the previous ones. More padding here, a different fit there, better support to distribute the weight. While working on the prosthetics, I continued the treatment with medicinal plants. The infection was under control, but the wounds still needed to heal completely. Every day, I applied new yarrow poultices, washed them with a golden seal infusion, and used pine resin on the most sensitive spots. I drank teas from plants with healing and strengthening properties, trying to help my body recover. It was a slow, painful process, full of setbacks and small advances. But one day, almost 3 months after that terrible awakening, I managed to stand up using my makeshift prosthetics. I took my first steps, wobbly and uncertain, but they were steps. I was no longer bound to the ground. I was no longer a crawling reptile. I had regained something of my humanity, my autonomy. I cried that day, not tears of pain or despair, like so many I had already shed, but tears of a strange emotion, a mixture of pride, relief, and hope. I had survived the unimaginable. I had refused the fate my son tried to impose on me. I had turned a death sentence into a journey of rediscovering my own strengths. By this point, I had established a routine that worked surprisingly well, considering the circumstances. I would wake with the sun, check and treat my wounds, adjust the prosthetics, and go out to collect water, medicinal plants, and food. I had mentally mapped the area within a nearly 1-mile radius around the cabin. I knew every water source, every fruit-bearing tree, every patch of useful herbs. The cabin, which was initially just the scene of my torment, had become a functional shelter. I repaired the roof as best I could, using palm leaves and vines, I sealed the larger cracks in the walls with a mixture of mud and straw. I created a raised bed with logs and branches to stay off the damp ground. I even improvised a kind of stove with rocks, where I could make a fire to cook roots and prepare remedies on colder days. Time passed, and with it came an internal transformation as profound as the physical changes I faced. The initial anger, that burning fury against Martin and Tiffany, did not disappear, but it transmuted into something different. It was no longer a consuming fire that threatened to devour me from within, but a controlled, directed flame that gave me purpose and clarity. I began to see my situation from a broader perspective. Yes, I had been the victim of unspeakable cruelty, but I had also been the protagonist of an extraordinary survival story. I had rediscovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, ancestral knowledge that had been belittled by the modern world, a connection with nature that most people would never experience. These reflections didn't happen in a structured way, with a set time for thinking. They came in flashes during the day, while I was doing routine tasks. They came in my dreams, which were less and less populated by nightmares and more by images of healing and transformation. They came on starry nights, when I would sit at the cabin door, watching the mountain sky, so immense and bright that it seemed almost within reach. If you also believe that ancient wisdom is often more powerful than modern medicine, give this a thumbs up. Let's see if we can get to 1,000 likes to show that the knowledge of the ancients still has value today. After 4 months since the abandonment, I was a completely different person. Physically, I was thinner, more resilient, with strong arms from moving around so much with the handmade crutches and prosthetics. My skin, once pale from age and city life, had taken on a tan, weathered by the mountain Sunday. My hair, which I couldn't cut, had grown long and had more white strands than I ever thought I would have. But the internal transformation was even more profound. The Clara May from before, the retired elderly lady who lived peacefully cultivating her herbs and occasionally visiting the city, seemed to have existed in another life. Now I was a survivor, a warrior, a woman who had looked death in the face and said, "Not today." During this period, I also continued to improve my prosthetics. The latest version, made from hickory wood, known for its exceptional strength, and padded with a mixture of plant fibers treated with natural resins for greater durability, allowed me to walk for considerable distances without excessive pain. It wasn't as comfortable as modern prosthetics, of course, but it served its purpose of giving me mobility. It was around this time, exploring areas further and further from the cabin, that I made a crucial discovery: a trail. It wasn't very visible, just a slightly marked path on the mountain floor, but it was clearly a trail made by humans, not animals. Following it for a few miles, an exhausting journey with my rudimentary prosthetics, I came to an encouraging conclusion. That path probably led to a road or a settlement. I returned to the cabin exhausted, but with a light heart for the first time in months. I had found a possible escape route, a way back to the world of the living. I wasn't ready to follow it yet. I needed to gather more strength, prepare supplies for the journey, perhaps improve the prosthetics even more. But the possibility was there, concrete, not just a distant dream. This is a profound shift. The cabin was meant to be her tomb, but it became her forge. Her anger has been tempered into pure purpose, and now that trail represents the first concrete hope of escape. She isn't just a victim anymore. She's a survivor with a plan. The next morning, while checking my wounds as I did daily, I noticed something impressive. They were almost completely healed. The scabs had fallen off, revealing new, pink skin. Sensation had returned, though it was uncomfortable in some spots. There were no more signs of infection, no foul odor, no abnormal discharge. It was living proof of the power of the plants my grandmother had taught me to use. Reflecting on everything I had been through, I felt a wave of gratitude for the knowledge I had received throughout my life. The wisdom of my grandmother Lily about the Appalachian plants, the techniques of Mr. Eugene for adapting to the loss of a limb, my father's stories of survival in the wilderness, even the basic first aid knowledge I learned from my midwife mother. All of this, which often seemed outdated or unnecessary in the modern world, had proven to be literally vital. But I also felt a firm resolution growing within me. I could not let Martin and Tiffany get away with what they did. Not for personal revenge, though God knows I would have that right, but for justice. People capable of amputating their own mother's legs and abandoning her to die slowly were too dangerous to walk free in society. Who else could they harm if they were willing to do this? I decided that as soon as I was strong enough to make the journey, I would follow that trail, return to civilization, go to the authorities, tell my story, show the proof on my own mutilated body, and do whatever was necessary to make them pay for their heinous crime. With this renewed purpose, I intensified my preparations. I improved the prosthetics even further, adding strips of rawhide from an animal I found dead to give the socket a firmer fit. I wove a bag from plant fibers to carry water and food during the journey. I prepared concentrated medicines, pine resin in small pellets, dried and ground yarrow leaves, dehydrated witch hazel leaves. By this time, I could walk for several hours with the prosthetics before the pain became unbearable. I practiced daily, gradually increasing the distance I covered. I created deliberate obstacles in my path, rocks, fallen logs, small holes to learn how to overcome them with the prosthetics. It was a self-imposed rehabilitation, without doctors, physical therapists, or modern equipment, just a stubborn old woman and her iron will. Nature, which had initially seemed like a prison, became my ally in this preparation. The rugged terrain of the mountains forced me to develop balance and strength. The climate, with its sharp variations between intense heat during the day and biting cold at night, toughened my frail body. The daily challenges of finding food, water, and shelter gave me a mental resilience I never thought I would have at my age. And so, day by day, I grew stronger, prepared myself, transformed myself. The cabin, which was meant to be my tomb, became my training ground, my makeshift gym, my recovery center. The woods, which were meant to be my tormentor, became my teacher, my provider, my silent partner in this unbelievable journey. 5 months after that fateful day, I decided it was time. I was ready to attempt the great journey, to follow the trail wherever it led, to return to the world of the living when everyone had already given me up for dead. I prepared everything the night before, the bag with water and food, the medicines in case I needed them, even a strong staff that would serve as extra support in the more difficult parts of the path. The next morning, with the rising sun painting the mountain sky in shades of pink and orange, I stood at the door of the cabin, leaning on my handmade prosthetics. I took one last look at that place that had been the scene of the worst and the best moments of my life. The worst, the brutal betrayal of my own son. The best, the discovery of a strength I never knew existed within me. "Thank you," I whispered to the cabin, to the woods, to all the plants and animals that had been my silent companions. "You taught me more than 79 years of life in the world out there." And with that, I took the first step of the journey that would lead me back to civilization, to justice, and to a life completely transformed by the experience of surviving the impossible. When I finally found that trail in the woods, after months in the cabin, I was ready to set off and return to civilization. But on the day I prepared to leave, a terrible storm broke over the mountains. The sky darkened in an instant. The thunder seemed to want to crack the world in half, and the rain fell with such force that even the strongest trees in the woods bowed. It was impossible to start a journey like that with my rudimentary prosthetics in that weather. It's a sign, I thought at the time. A sign to stay a little longer, to prepare better. And that's what I did. Using the time the rain gave me, I started working on the makeshift crutches I had made before. They were functional, but far from ideal for a long walk. I found stronger branches felled by the storm, especially from hickory and oak, woods known for their hardness. I used vines, which become more flexible after the rain, to tie the parts together. The result was crutches that were much more stable than the previous ones. But the real breakthrough was the prosthetics. The first ones I made were almost a joke compared to what I managed to develop later. Remembering the teachings of Mr. Eugene, the veteran who lost his arm, I refined the design. I carved the wood with patience, using sharp rocks as tools, shaping it to fit perfectly onto the stumps of my legs. I used pine resin, which hardens like cement when it dries, to fix all the parts. For padding, I used a mixture of dried moss, soft fibers from sycamore trees, and the inner bark of poplar trees, forming a natural cushion that protected my sensitive skin. The result wasn't pretty to look at, nothing like the modern carbon fiber prosthetics you see at the Paralympics, but they worked. They allowed me to stand, walk for increasingly longer distances, and even carry small weights. The feeling of being able to move like that after months of dragging myself on the ground is something I can't properly explain. It was as if I had been reborn, as if each step was a small victory against those who wanted to bury me. While the heavy rains continued, as they often do in this region, I decided I needed to think more long-term. The cabin Martin chose to be my tomb had to become my fortress. The thatched roof had more holes than my grandmother's old sieve. So, I began to reinforce it, using large leaves from magnolia trees, which grew near the creek, carefully woven together with vines. The log walls had cracks where the cold night wind entered without asking permission. Using mud from the creek mixed with shredded dry grass, an old technique my father taught me, I sealed every one of them. The packed earth floor became a problem when the heavy rains started forming puddles inside the cabin. I solved this by collecting flat stones from the woods and creating a rustic pavement in the most critical areas. But perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the rainwater harvesting system. I used large magnolia leaves, the same ones I used to reinforce the roof, to create natural gutters that directed the rainwater into a large wooden basin I found abandoned in a corner of the cabin. This water was filtered through sand, charcoal, and gravel, arranged in layers inside a gourd with a hole in the bottom. Another old technique I learned from Grandma Lily. The result was clean, safe water for drinking and for my remedies. Near the cabin, I started a small medicinal herb garden. It wasn't just for convenience. Although it was good to have the most important plants within reach, it was also a way of giving thanks for everything these plants had done for me. I carefully transplanted seedlings of yarrow, witch hazel, golden seal, pine, and dozens of other herbs I had known since I was a girl. I created raised beds using logs and stones so I could tend to them without having to bend over too much, which was difficult with my prosthetics. The rains also gave me the idea to create a small vegetable garden. I found squash seeds in one of the fruits I had gathered, wild cherry tomato seeds that grew in some areas, and even okra seeds that must have come from something I'd eaten. And the seeds survived in my natural compost, if you know what I mean. The soil in the mountains is tough for planting, but rich in nutrients if you know how to work it. I mixed in animal droppings I found in the woods, decomposing leaves, and soil from an abandoned anthill, a secret that few know. It's one of the richest soils there is. My mornings now had a well-established routine. I would wake with the sun, check my prosthetics, make adjustments if necessary, and go out to check the herb and vegetable gardens. I would harvest what was ready, water when it hadn't rained, and pull weeds. Then I would go to the water collection system to check the level and quality. The rest of the day was divided between further improving the cabin's adaptations, refining the prosthetics, and preparing natural remedies using the herbs from the garden. Near the cabin, I discovered a small natural cave formed by large limestone rocks, so common in this region. It was the perfect place to store the medicines I prepared, as it maintained a lower and more constant temperature, even on the hottest days. I organized everything there, the tinctures in small gourds sealed with beeswax, the salves in improvised pots made of tree bark, the dried herbs in little bundles of plant fiber. The months went by, and with them, my skill with the prosthetics constantly improved. I could now walk for miles without extreme discomfort, go up and down small hills, and even carry a reasonable weight when needed. I had developed my own walking technique, adapted to the characteristics of my wooden prosthetics. It wasn't exactly elegant, but it was efficient. With all this, the idea of leaving the cabin and trying to reach civilization became increasingly distant, not out of fear or inability, but because, in a strange and unexpected way, I had found a life there, a hard, challenging life, far from any modern comfort, but genuinely my own. For the first time in many years, I was not living in anyone's shadow, not my late husband's, not my ungrateful son's, not society's expectations of a nearly 80-year-old woman. I was rebuilding not just my body, but my identity. Clara May, the healer of the mountains. Clara May, the survivor. Clara May, the woman who refused to die when she was supposed to. It was on a morning like any other, almost 6 months after that fateful day, that I heard the sound that would change everything again. Human voices. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, that the loneliness had finally taken its toll on my sanity. But no, they were real voices, approaching on the same trail I had discovered months before. I confess my first instinct was to hide. After so much time alone, the idea of human contact was almost as frightening as the rattlesnake from the creek, but curiosity won out. Leaning on my crutches, I came out of the cabin and waited in the small clearing in front. There were 4 people, 3 men and a woman, all dressed for fieldwork, with large backpacks and equipment I didn't immediately recognize. When they saw me, they stopped as if they had seen a ghost. And thinking about it, maybe that's what I looked like. A thin old woman with disheveled gray hair down to her waist. Clothes mended in improbable ways, leaning on crutches made of branches, with rustic wooden prosthetics where her legs should have been. "My God!" exclaimed the woman, the first to find her voice. "Ma'am, who are you? How did you get here?" "My name is Clara May Thompson," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse, "and I live here." The 4 of them looked at each other, clearly confused. It was then that one of the men, the oldest of the group, took a step forward. "Mrs. Thompson, are you by any chance the medicinal herb specialist who lived near Afton?" I nodded, surprised that someone knew me. "We've been looking for you for months," he continued, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "Your son reported that you had disappeared during a spiritual retreat. Later, he claimed to have found a body he believed to be yours. There was even a funeral. This is the plot twist none of us saw coming. He didn't just leave her for dead, he declared her dead. He held her funeral while she was fighting for her life. Now, the fight for justice becomes even more urgent. Does that send a shiver down your spine, hearing that? He didn't just leave me for dead. He erased me. He used my own money, most likely, to buy a crooked doctor, a death certificate, and to bury an empty box. That's when I knew, for sure. The boy I raised, my son. He was already long gone. The shock of those words hit me like a lightning bolt. Martin hadn't just abandoned me to die. He had gone further. He had declared me officially dead. He was probably already enjoying my inheritance, Harold's pension, the lands in the mountains. The audacity, the cold calculation of that plan left me momentarily speechless. The group introduced themselves. They were researchers from the University of Virginia, specialists in medicinal plants of the Appalachian region. They had come to the mountains to collect species for a study, and by chance had found what they called an incredibly diverse and well-tended botanical garden in the middle of nowhere. They followed the evidence of human cultivation and arrived at my cabin. When they saw my condition, the amputated legs, the improvised prosthetics, the survival system I had set up, they were torn between horror and amazement. The woman, Dr. Richardson, who I found out was a medical doctor in addition to being a botanist, insisted on examining my wounds. Her astonishment at the state of healing was immense. "It's unbelievable," she murmured as she examined the stumps of my legs. "With this level of trauma, without medical assistance in the middle of the woods, you should have died from infection within days. How did you do it?" I showed them my herb garden, the small natural pharmacy I had set up in the stone cave. I explained the treatments I applied. They took notes frantically, photographed everything, asked question after question. That knowledge that the modern world often dismisses as old wives' tales suddenly seemed precious in the eyes of these scientists. But there were more urgent matters to address. When I told them the full truth that my own son had amputated my legs and abandoned me there to die, all for the inheritance, the horror on their faces was palpable. "We need to take you to Richmond immediately," said Professor Miller, the oldest of the group. "This is attempted murder. It's a heinous crime." Part of me wanted to stay. That cabin that had started as my prison had become my kingdom. There, I was self-sufficient, strong, capable. In the world out there, I would again be the pitiful old lady, the poor, mutilated woman. But justice spoke louder. Martin needed to pay for what he did, not just for my sake, but so he could never do something similar to anyone else. The journey back to civilization was slow and uncomfortable. My cabin was truly isolated, and even with the help of the researchers, the trek to where they had left their jeep was arduous. I insisted on using my own prosthetics and crutches, refusing to be carried. It was important that they saw, that the world saw, what I had managed to create to survive. Arriving in Richmond, I was taken directly to the university hospital. The medical team that received me oscillated between shock at the mutilation I had suffered and admiration for the recovery I had achieved without professional assistance. Tests confirmed what I already knew. The wounds were completely healed, with no serious complications other than the amputation itself. "It's a medical miracle," said one of the specialists. Or rather, a miracle of the traditional medicine you applied. Simultaneously, the police were notified. My statement was taken right there in the hospital, with all the horrifying details of what Martin and Tiffany had done. The detective who took the case confessed that in 20 years on the force, he had never seen anything like it. The calculated cruelty, the coldness, and against his own mother, he commented, shaking his head in disbelief. Martin and Tiffany were located and arrested the same day. They were living in my old apartment in Richmond, using my credit cards, driving my car. When the police arrived, they still had the audacity to deny everything. My mother died during a spiritual retreat in the mountains. "I even have the death certificate," Martin argued, not knowing I was alive and had told them everything. The case exploded in the media. Son amputates mother's legs and abandons her in the woods for inheritance. The headlines were splashed across newspapers, websites, and television news. I was approached by dozens of reporters, wanting to hear my story. At first I refused, still processing everything that was happening. But then I realized that making it public could help other people, especially the elderly, who suffer silent abuse from their own family members. The investigation revealed the extent of Martin's macabre plan. He hadn't just amputated and abandoned me. He had a whole scheme prepared for afterward. He had forged documents stating that I suffered from advanced-stage Alzheimer's, which would explain an eventual disappearance during a supposed spiritual retreat. He paid a corrupt doctor to issue a death certificate when he found a body he claimed was mine. He even organized a closed-casket funeral, citing an advanced state of decomposition. With these documents, he gained access to all my bank accounts, Harold's pension, and was in the process of selling the mountain lands to a developer who planned a luxury condo complex in the area. The plan was so well crafted that no one questioned it. After all, who would doubt a son mourning the death of his elderly mother? The trial was swift by American justice standards. The evidence was overwhelming. My testimony, the physical evidence of the amputation, the forged documents, even security camera footage showing them buying suspicious materials like saws, sedatives, and industrial disinfectants days before the crime. Martin was sentenced to 28 years in prison for attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud, forgery, and other crimes. Tiffany got 22 years as an accomplice. During the trial, I saw my son for the first time since that day in the cabin. He looked worn down, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes. When our eyes met, I saw something in his that I had never seen before. Fear. Not the normal fear of someone facing justice, but an almost supernatural fear, as if he were seeing a ghost. Well, in a way, that's what I was, the ghost of the mother he thought he had killed. After the conviction, I legally recovered everything he had taken. The bank accounts, the pension, the lands in the mountains, which by a hair's breadth were not sold, the apartment in Richmond. But these material things that had seemed so important before now had a different meaning. They were tools, not ends in themselves. Tools to build a new life with renewed purpose. What surprised me was how my story captured the public's imagination. Suddenly, I wasn't just a victim of a horrible crime. I was a symbol of resilience, of ancestral wisdom, of a female strength that refuses to be broken. I received invitations for interviews, lectures, and even to write a book about my experience and knowledge. The University of Virginia, through the same researchers who found me, invited me to give a series of lectures on traditional medicine of the Appalachian region. At first, I hesitated. Who would want to listen to a semi-literate old woman talking about old wives' tales? But Dr. Richardson insisted, you have knowledge that books don't teach, that laboratories haven't discovered. This is science too, a living empirical science tested by generations. I accepted, more out of curiosity than conviction. The first lecture was to a packed auditorium. Students of medicine, pharmacy, biology, nursing, all wanting to hear the healer of the mountains, as they nicknamed me. I spoke about the plants that saved my life, about how to identify them, harvest them at the right time, and prepare them correctly. I showed them the prosthetics I had created, explained the techniques. No frills, no technical terms, just the pure and simple knowledge I inherited from my grandmother Lily and refined throughout my life. To my surprise, I wasn't met with skepticism or condescension. The students asked genuine questions, took notes as if they were in an important class. Some even asked to touch the wooden prosthetics I still used occasionally, even though the hospital had provided me with modern ones later. The professors, especially the older ones, recognized me as a fellow educator, not a folkloric curiosity. This recognition opened doors I never imagined. I was invited to collaborate with the university's botany team on a project to catalog and preserve traditional knowledge about medicinal plants of the Appalachian region. My herb garden at the cabin, which I insisted on keeping even after buying a small house in Afton, became a study site for researchers from all over the country. In partnership with the Department of Mechanical Engineering, my wooden prosthetics were studied as an example of appropriate technology, simple, low-cost solutions that can be reproduced in remote or resource-poor areas. The students developed improved versions based on my original design, maintaining the simplicity but increasing durability and comfort. 3 months after the trial, I received a letter from Martin. He asked for forgiveness. I read and reread that letter, and what I felt, to my surprise, was not hatred. It was nothing. It was as if I were reading about a stranger. The boy I carried in my womb had died for me in that cabin. I never answered the letter. I never went to visit him. I know some of you will call me a hard-hearted mother, a woman who can't forgive. But you weren't the one lying there, smelling your own flesh rot. I learned something powerful in that cabin. Healing is about you. Forgiveness is about them. You don't need to forgive someone to heal. You just need to forgive yourself, for ever trusting them in the first place. This is a lesson so many of us need to hear. She redefines what it means to heal, separating it from the world's pressure to forgive. She's taking back her own story, but what she chooses to do with that story is the most powerful part of all. Some people criticized me for this. They say forgiveness is liberating. But I learned something in that cabin, alone with my pain. Healing and forgiveness are not the same thing. Forgiveness is about the other person. Healing is about times you asterisk. You don't need to forgive someone to heal. You just need to forgive yourself for trusting them. You need to reclaim your own story. My healing wasn't found in a prison visiting room. It was found in the East End, teaching a new generation. Do you think I was too harsh for not forgiving my son? Tell me your thoughts, because this is a weight I still carry. What would you do if your closest family tried to kill you for money? Is there forgiveness for a betrayal of this magnitude? Instead of consuming myself with these questions, I chose to focus on the good things that came from this terrible experience. With the recovered money, I set up a small laboratory in my new house in Afton. Nothing too sophisticated, but enough to continue producing the natural remedies I learned to make throughout my life and perfected during those months in the cabin. At first, I only produced for friends, neighbors, and the occasional researchers who visited me. But my fame began to spread. People came from afar seeking Mrs. Clara May's salve for arthritis, the survivor's syrup for bronchitis, the mountain tincture for skin problems. I started receiving so many orders that I had to hire helpers, young people from the region who were interested in learning the traditional knowledge that was being lost. I never charged much for the remedies, just enough to cover the costs and pay the helpers fairly. I never patented the formulas. I never wanted to turn it into a big business. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about honoring the knowledge of my grandmother Lily, about keeping alive a tradition that almost died with me in that cabin. It was about helping people who, like me, needed healing for wounds of the body and soul. The lands in the mountains that Martin almost sold for a luxury condo complex were transformed into a private reserve, ensuring their perpetual protection. With the help of the university and some environmental NGOs, we cataloged over 200 species of medicinal plants that grow naturally there. We built a small facility to host students, researchers, and people interested in learning about the Appalachian wilderness and its treasures. The cabin where I spent those 6 months of trial was preserved, with some structural improvements to prevent it from collapsing. I kept all the adaptations I had made, the water collection system, the raised garden, even the first versions of the prosthetics. It became a kind of living museum, a material testament to my journey. I take selected groups there, usually medical or nursing students, to show how necessity sharpens ingenuity, how traditional knowledge can save lives when modern medicine is unavailable. My modern prosthetics, provided by the hospital, are comfortable and efficient. They allow me to move without pain, to do practically everything I did before. But I confess that I still use my wooden creations occasionally, especially when I'm alone in the reserve. There is something in them that connects me to that transformative experience, that reminds me of the strength I discovered within myself when everything else was taken away. The lectures continued, not just at the university, but in schools, community centers, and medical conferences. My message is always the same. Traditional knowledge and modern science are not opposites, they are complementary. One does not replace the other, but together they can create something more powerful than the sum of their parts. It's a message that resonates, especially with young people, who are seeking a deeper connection with their roots in a world that is increasingly technological and disconnected from nature. With the help of an anthropologist from the university, I began to systematically record everything I know about medicinal plants. Not just the names and uses, but the stories behind them, the people who taught me, the cultural contexts. It is slow, meticulous work, but vital. As I always tell the students, when an elder dies, a whole library burns. I don't want the knowledge of my grandmother Lily, added to what I have learned and discovered throughout my life, to be lost when I am gone. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my legs, the life I had before. The honest answer is no. Of course, there are moments of frustration when something simple becomes complicated, when the prosthetics hurt on damp days, when I remember the pain and betrayal that caused this loss. But what I gained in return, the inner strength, the renewed purpose, the positive impact I now have on so many people's lives, far outweighs what I lost. Perhaps the greatest gain was freedom. Freedom from the roles that society imposes on an elderly woman. Freedom from expectations, from invisible limits, from the smallness they try to reduce us to when our hair turns white and wrinkles deepen. No one looks at me and sees just a cute little old lady. They see a survivor, a guardian of ancestral knowledge, a woman who faced the worst one human being can do to another and emerged stronger on the other side. When I look back at the winding path that brought me here, I can't help but see a certain poetry in my journey. The country girl who learned about plants from her Cherokee grandmother, the young woman who went to the big city, married an important man, and distanced herself from her roots, the mother who spoiled her only son too much, not realizing the snake she was creating, the elderly woman who, through the most terrible of betrayals, found her way back to her origins, to the knowledge she had always carried within her. Sometimes, when I'm in the herb garden at the reserve, with my hands in the dirt and the mountain sun on my face, I feel my grandmother Lily beside me, not as a supernatural presence, but as a continuity, an invisible thread that connects generations through shared knowledge. A plant only grows strong when it knows its roots, she used to say. It took me a lifetime to fully understand what that meant. And so the story that began with a brutal betrayal transformed into a journey of rediscovery, of purpose, of positive impact on the world. The scars I carry, both the visible ones on my amputated legs and the invisible ones on my soul, are not marks of victimization, but medals from a battle I won against all odds. Back then, at 79, with 2 prosthetics in place of my legs, and a wisdom that only extreme adversity can bring. I felt like I was just getting started. There is still so much to do, so much knowledge to preserve, so many people to help. The life my son tried to take from me in that isolated cabin now overflows with purpose and meaning. As an old Appalachian saying my cattle driver, father used to repeat goes, "A crooked tree can still give straight shade." My story took a crooked, painful turn that no one could have predicted or desired. But the shade it now casts, the impact, the legacy, the inspiration it offers to others, is straighter and truer than I ever imagined possible. The years passed too quickly after the rescue, the trial, and all that upheaval in my life. Today, 5 years later, I live in a simple house on the outskirts of Richmond, adapted to my needs. Nothing too fancy, but functional. The door frames are wider to get through with a wheelchair on days when my legs hurt too much to use the prosthetics. The bathroom has grab bars, the shower has a bench, the sink is lower so I can reach it while seated. The modern prosthetics I use to go out are a marvel of technology. Lightweight, made of carbon fiber, with joints that mimic the natural movement of ankles. The people at the university made sure I received the best available, even though they were very expensive. "You deserve it after everything you've been through," they said. I'm very grateful for that. I won't deny it. They allow me to walk for hours without pain, go up and down stairs almost normally, and even dance a slow country dance when the occasion allows. But I confess that inside the house, I still often use the wooden prosthetics I made back in the cabin. They're not exactly the same anymore. They've been improved, reinforced, adapted over time, but they maintain the essence of the ones that saved my life. There's something about them that connects me to that experience, that reminds me of the strength I discovered when I was alone, abandoned, with nothing but my own hands and knowledge. The folks at the biomedical engineering department don't understand my stubbornness. Mrs. Clara May, these rustic prosthetics can damage your skin, cause imbalance, even lead to back problems, they argue, full of sincere concern. I appreciate their concern, but I explain that the imperfections of my handmade prosthetics carry history and meaning. They are like the wrinkles on my face, marks of a life lived intensely, with all its ups and downs. My routine today is full, much fuller than I ever imagined at my age. 3 times a week, I go to the East End, one of the poorest areas of the city, where I teach classes on medicinal plants to young people from the neighborhood. It started as a small project in partnership with a local NGO. The idea was simple. Teach these boys and girls to identify plants with healing properties that grow right there, in vacant lots, in backyards, sometimes even in the cracks of the asphalt. This little plant you call a weed, that people pull up and throw away, can cure a stomachache, inflammation, even help heal wounds, I explained to them, showing them a stalk of golden seal growing unassumingly in a corner of the community association's lot. At first, many laughed skeptically. "That's old folks' stuff, Mrs. Clara May. We have medicine from the pharmacy now," they would say. But slowly, they began to see the value of that knowledge. First, because many families there don't have money to buy medicine. Second, because they started to see concrete results. The tea that relieved a little brother's bronchitis. The compress that reduced the inflammation in a father's knee from his construction job. The salve that cleared up a cousin's fungal infection. And third, perhaps most importantly, because they realized that this ancestral knowledge connected them to their own roots, to their grandmothers from the South, to their Cherokee or African American great-grandmothers, whose voices were silenced by time and society. Today, the project serves over 100 young people, mostly girls between 14 and 18. We don't just teach them to identify plants and their uses. We teach them to cultivate them sustainably, to process them correctly, to combine traditional knowledge with safe practices of hygiene and preservation. It's a complete course recognized by the Board of Education as a valid extracurricular activity for the school curriculum. You are learning much more than botany, I always tell them. You are learning that knowledge doesn't just come from expensive books and universities. It also comes from the calloused hands of elders, from stories passed down through generations, from the patient observation of nature. Many of these young people now dream of careers in healthcare, biology, agronomy. Some are already in college studying pharmacy, medicine, nursing. Others have started small local businesses, producing natural remedies, handmade cosmetics, special teas. Together, we created a cooperative that helps market these products, ensuring an income for families who previously lived in situations of extreme vulnerability. But the most valuable thing I try to impart to these young people is not technical knowledge about plants. It is a philosophy of life that I developed during my months in the cabin and refined in the years that followed. I summarize it in a sentence that I repeat like a mantra. The same hands that can cut can also heal. The choice is ours. This is her ultimate victory. Martin used his hands to destroy, and Clara May is using hers to build a legacy. She didn't just survive. She found her true purpose. And you'll want to hear how she's changing the world, right now, with that knowledge. That's the greatest lesson I carried out of those woods. Martin used his hands to cut. I used mine to heal. Every single day, every one of us has that same choice. So I ask you, what will you do with your hands today? I explain to them that this sentence has many levels of meaning. In the most literal sense, my son's hands cut off my legs, causing unimaginable pain and suffering. But my own hands later gathered plants, prepared remedies, built prosthetics, and healed me. In a metaphorical sense, it speaks to how all of us, every day, have the power to hurt or heal the people around us with our actions, words, even our thoughts. And in a deeper sense, it is about how life inevitably wounds us. But we can choose to use those wounds as a source of bitterness, or as an opportunity for growth and healing for ourselves and for others. This philosophy shaped my journey of reconciliation, not with Martin, who continues to serve his sentence in prison, but with myself and my past. It was a long and winding road, full of difficult moments, of tears shed in the loneliness of the night, of unanswered questions. For a long time, I blamed myself for what happened. Where did I go wrong in raising him? What could I have done differently? Was it because I spoiled him too much? Because I wasn't tougher, more present, more attentive to the signs? These questions tormented me, kept me up at night, and ate away at me from the inside, just as the infection almost ate away at the stumps of my legs in that cabin. It was in a session with the university psychologist, who kindly offered me free counseling after everything I went through, that I had a transformative insight. She asked me to describe how I felt about what Martin had done, without thinking too much, just letting the words flow naturally. I feel amputated. I answered without hesitation, not just physically in my legs, but in my soul. As if something essential had been cut from me: trust, innocence, the ability to believe in the unconditional love between a mother and son. She was silent for a moment, letting me absorb the weight of those words. Then she asked, "And what did you do when your legs were amputated? How did you react to that?" The answer came naturally. I adapted. I created new ways to move, to interact with the world. I turned limitations into new paths. She smiled gently. Exactly. And that is what you are doing now with the emotional amputation. You are adapting, creating new ways to love, to trust, to relate to the world. You are growing around the wound, like the plants you know so well. That session changed my perspective. I began to see that I didn't need to deny the pain, pretend it didn't exist, or overcome it completely to move forward. I could incorporate it into my new identity, just as I incorporated the prosthetics into my way of walking. Different, adapted, but still authentically mine. I developed a metaphor that I use a lot in my lectures and conversations with young people. Life amputated much more than my legs, but like the plants I've studied my whole life, I adapted to grow even in the most hostile terrain. I explain that the plants of the mountains are masters of surviving in extreme conditions: poor soils, prolonged droughts, periodic fires. They develop deep roots, twisted trunks, leaves adapted to conserve water. They don't fight against the hostile environment. They transform themselves to thrive in it. You can do that too, I tell my young students, especially the girls who come from situations of abuse, violence, abandonment. Don't let difficult circumstances determine who you are or what you can become. Adapt, transform, grow through and around the obstacles. This message resonates especially with women of all ages who approach me after my lectures or classes. Many cry as they tell me their own stories of betrayal, abandonment, violence, often at the hands of those who should have loved and protected them. Sons who exploit them financially, husbands who cheat on or abuse them, fathers who abandon them, brothers who deceive them. For them, I have developed a set of lessons that I call the wisdom of the Appalachian woods for women. They are simple principles, rooted both in my personal experience and in my observation of nature over decades. Independence. Be like the hickory tree, which flourishes even far from the river. I explain that just as certain mountain trees have developed incredibly deep roots to seek water in subterranean layers, women need to develop internal resources so as not to depend entirely on external sources of validation, protection, or sustenance. Self-confidence. Trust the knowledge your body carries. I show them how plants seem to know exactly when to bloom, when to release seeds, when to go dormant, without needing external instructions. Our bodies and intuitions also carry wisdom, often ignored in favor of external voices of authority. Valuing ancestral knowledge. The oldest seeds are the ones that best resist future droughts. I teach that the knowledge passed down by our grandmothers and great-grandmothers about plants, natural cycles, healing, childbirth, death, is not primitive superstition, as many would have us believe, but wisdom tested by generations, often more sustainable and humane than modern alternatives. Resilience. After a fire, the forest is the first to bloom again. I show how the woods not only survive periodic fires but, in a way, depend on them to renew themselves. Similarly, many women emerge from the fires of life divorces, losses, betrayals, failures not just as survivors, but renewed, with a clarity and purpose they didn't have before. Interdependence. Even the strongest oak depends on the invisible fungi in its roots. I explain that independence does not mean isolation. The most resilient plants in the woods have complex symbiotic relationships with fungi, bacteria, and pollinating insects. Similarly, strong women know the difference between toxic dependency and healthy connections of mutual support. Transmission. A plant that does not produce seeds disappears. I teach that our knowledge, experiences, and lessons only stay alive if we pass them on to daughters, granddaughters, students, neighbors, anyone willing to receive them. To hide what we know, whether out of fear, shame, or the illusion that no one is interested, is to allow vital wisdom to be lost. Many women tell me that these lessons have changed their lives. Some left abusive relationships. Others resumed interrupted studies. Several started small businesses based on knowledge they already had but didn't value. Some simply gained the confidence to speak up, to take up space, to demand respect. The question I am asked most often, inevitably, is about forgiveness. Did you forgive your son? It seems everyone wants to know this, as if forgiveness were the only acceptable ending to a story of brutal betrayal like mine, as if it were my obligation as a mother, as a woman, as an elder, as a spiritual person to forgive the unforgivable. My answer is always the same, honest and direct. It's not hatred I feel, it's pity. He amputated not only my legs but his own humanity. I explain that to forgive in the sense of saying, "It's okay, it doesn't matter," would be to deny the gravity of what was done. It would diminish not only my suffering, but the monstrous act itself. Some things should not be forgiven easily, at the risk of trivializing evil, of making the unacceptable acceptable. "But don't you get bitter carrying that weight?" they ask, genuinely concerned. I reply that there is a difference between not forgiving and living consumed by hatred or revenge. I choose not to let what Martin did define my life or occupy my daily thoughts. I choose to focus on the good things that were born from that terrible experience. The young people I now teach, the lives I touch with my lectures, the knowledge I preserve, the inner strength I discovered. It's like using my prosthetics, I explain. I don't pretend my legs are still there. I don't deny the amputation, but I also don't let it stop me from walking, from dancing, from living fully. I acknowledge the reality of the loss, but I build something new and functional from it. This journey of transforming trauma into purpose, loss into growth, betrayal into shared wisdom, has been neither linear nor easy. There were days when I sank into a depression so deep I could barely get out of bed. Nights when I woke up screaming, reliving the moment I realized my legs had been cut off. Occasions when the anger was so intense I thought it would consume me completely. Healing, I discovered, is not a straight line, but a spiral. Sometimes we pass by the same points of pain, but each time from a slightly different, slightly higher perspective. Sometimes progress is only perceptible when we look back and see how far we've climbed the spiral, even when it felt like we were walking in circles. In those difficult times, what helped me were the same things that kept me alive in that cabin: ancestral knowledge, a connection with nature, and a typical Appalachian stubbornness that refuses to give up. I learned to use plants with calming properties, like lemon balm and chamomile, not just as tea, but in baths and aromatic sachets for moments of anxiety. I began to meditate daily, watching the sunrise, a practice my grandmother Lily did without calling it meditation. She would just say she was talking to the coming day. I kept a journal where I recorded not only the difficult moments but also the small daily victories, the moments of unexpected joy, the lessons learned. Today, at 84 years old, with prosthetics in place of my legs and more wisdom than I ever thought I would accumulate, I look back on my story with new eyes. That terrible awakening in the cabin, the amputated legs, the horror of the betrayal, it was the worst moment of my life, without a doubt. But it was also the beginning of a journey I would never have undertaken under other circumstances. It's as if I have lived two completely different lives. The first, as Clara May, daughter of a cattle driver and a midwife, then wife of a public servant, mother of an only son, a respectable but ordinary lady whose talents and knowledge were seen as folkloric curiosities at best, outdated superstitions at worst. The second, as Mrs. Clara May, the survivor, the wise woman, the teacher, whose experience and knowledge are valued, studied, and preserved for future generations. Sometimes I find myself thinking about that morning I woke up in the cabin with my newly amputated legs, my mind clouded by sedation, my body in shock, my heart broken by the deepest betrayal one can imagine. I remember the absolute despair, the certainty that I would die there, alone and forgotten. I remember the unbearable physical pain, the fever that made me delirious, the infection that I could feel and smell spreading through the stumps of my legs. But now, with the distance that only time can provide, I see that moment not just as the beginning of the worst period of my life, but also as the starting point for the best version of myself. It was there, at the bottom of the pit, in the deepest darkness, that I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. It was there that I rediscovered the value of the knowledge I had carried my whole life but never fully appreciated. It was there that I began the journey that brought me here. A woman of 84, who still has much to offer the world, much to teach, much to live. I am not romanticizing the trauma. Understand me well. I am not saying that we need to go through unimaginable horrors to find purpose or inner strength. I would never tell anyone that extreme pain is a gift or a blessing in disguise. What Martin did to me was monstrous, unforgivable, and I would have preferred 1,000 times that it had never happened. But since it did happen, since I cannot change the past, I choose to extract from it the maximum possible meaning, growth, and positive impact. I choose to transform that terrible experience into something that can help other people, especially women, find their own strength in moments of darkness. Aren't you afraid of dying? A girl of about 15 once asked me after a class on medicinal plants in the East End. The question took me by surprise with its frankness, but I answered with the same honesty. I've already died once, girl, back in that cabin. The Clara May I was before died there. The one here talking to you is another, born from the remains of the previous one. She seemed confused, so I explained further. When we lose something fundamental in my case, my legs, the trust in my son, the life I knew, it's like a small death. It hurts. It's scary. It feels like the end of everything. But if we survive that death, we are reborn different. Not better, not worse, necessarily. Just different, with other priorities, other values, another way of seeing the world. This is the heart of her story. She didn't just survive the trauma, she was completely reborn from it. And the wisdom she now shares from that experience, especially with other women, is perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. And would you rather not have died that way? She insisted. Of course, I would rather have my legs. I would rather my son were a decent person. I would rather not have gone through that suffering, I replied. But given that I can't change what happened, I prefer this version of myself, stronger, wiser, more useful to the world than the one that existed before. This is the message I hope to leave when my time here is over. Not that we should thank those who deeply hurt us, not that we should romanticize suffering, but that we have within us, like the most resilient plants of the mountains, the ability to adapt, transform, and even flourish in the most arid and hostile soils of human experience. Recently, a documentary crew was at my house to record my story. They wanted to make a film about my journey, from the cattle driver's daughter to the survivor of betrayal, the healer of the mountains, the teacher of the youth in the inner city. During the filming, they asked me to show them the handmade prosthetics I made in the cabin, which I still keep as precious relics. Holding those pieces of crudely carved wood, tied with plant fibers now worn by time, I had a powerful wave of memories. I remembered my trembling hands trying to carve the hardwood with improvised tools, the blisters that formed on my palms, the blood that stained the fibers as I wove them, the tears of frustration when the first versions broke under my weight, the indescribable joy when I finally managed to stand, to take those first wobbly steps. These are not just prosthetics, I said to the camera, my voice thick with emotion. They are tangible proof that we can create tools to overcome any obstacle if we have knowledge, determination, and, above all, the refusal to accept the limitations that others try to impose on us. That is perhaps the most important lesson I have learned in this entire journey. The most dangerous limitations are not the physical ones, the lack of legs, old age, the scars that still ache on rainy days. They are the mental ones. The belief that we are too weak, too old, too ignorant, too insignificant to make a difference. They are the social ones, the expectations that the elderly, especially elderly women, should retreat to a corner and quietly wait for the end, without bothering anyone, without taking up space, without demanding a voice or respect. Breaking these invisible limitations was, in many ways, harder than surviving in the cabin. It required questioning deeply ingrained assumptions about my worth, my ability, my place in the world. It required challenging not only what others thought I could do, but what I myself believed was possible. When I speak to audiences of young people, especially girls and women, I emphasize this point. The world will try to convince you that you are small, weak, incapable. It will tell you that your dreams are too big, your voice is too loud, your ambitions too unrealistic. Don't believe it. I, a semi-literate old woman from rural Virginia, amputated and abandoned to die, survived. More than that, I found purpose, impact, meaning. You, with all the youth, education, and opportunities you have, can do infinitely more. It's a message that resonates. I see in their eyes the spark of possibility, the flicker of determination. Many approach me afterward to tell me how they've changed their perspective, how they've started to see themselves not as passive victims of circumstances, but as active protagonists of their own stories. That is why I continue, even when my body tires, even when the prosthetics hurt, even when the memory of those terrible days returns to haunt me on sleepless nights. On days when the physical or emotional pain seems too much to bear, I return to the philosophy I developed in the cabin. The same hands that can cut can also heal. The choice is ours. I remember that I choose, every day, to use my hands, my voice, my story, to heal myself and others, instead of cutting, hurting, destroying. It is a choice I have to make consciously, repeatedly, sometimes moment by moment. Because the truth I discovered, which is often hard to accept, is that we all have within us the capacity for both cruelty and compassion. I saw it in Martin, the sweet boy who was one day transformed into the man capable of amputating his own mother's legs. I saw it in myself, the moments when the anger was so intense that I wished I could do to him what he did to me, the days when hatred threatened to consume everything good in me. The difference lies in the choices we make, in the small daily decisions that, added up over time, define who we are, who we become. Martin chose the path of greed, of cruelty, of dehumanizing another, even his own mother. I chose, and continue to choose, the path of healing, of transformation, of humanization, even of the most dehumanizing experience imaginable. It is not an easy path. There are days when the darkness seems too great, the challenges insurmountable, the pain unbearable. Days when I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just give up, to surrender to resentment, to bitterness, to isolation. But then I remember the plants of the mountains, how they adapt, how they persist, how they flourish, even in the most adverse conditions, and I find the strength to continue, one day at a time, one choice at a time. At 84, I watch the children of the East End, my spiritual heirs, carefully crushing leaves to make medicine. The circle of life is a curious thing. My story began with my own son's hands. Hands I once held cutting off my legs for greed. Now, it ends with these young hands, eager to learn my legacy, not for money, but to heal. They are planting life where Martin sowed death. Watching them, I see my grandmother's legacy, and my own is safe. I feel at peace. Stories of healing need to be shared. If you agree, please subscribe so you don't miss our next journeys.